Right behind me is 350 St. Anne's Avenue in the Mott Haven section of the South Bronx, a building known as Thessalonica Court. This is where 3 teenage boys were executed in cold blood in 1992. The investigation into their murders produced a list of suspects, which resulted in a tangled web of accusations, inconsistent stories, and questionable convictions. 15-year-old Damien Salgado lived at 350 St. Anne's on the 5th floor, and just across the hall from him lived 15-year-old Danny Santiago. Danny was an athlete and honor student at Elijah Clark Junior High School, and Damien attended IS 139. Danny and Damien were known as good kids who stayed out of trouble. Another friend of theirs was 16-year-old Otis Blair, who was called O. Known as a jokester, O attended Grace Dodge Vocational School and was a standout athlete. O lived nearby at 352 Beekman Avenue, which was a rundown building with bullet holes in the front door. Next door at 348 Beekman was where the notorious drug gang known as the Wild Cowboys operated. Beekman Avenue was a chaotic, violent block, and in June of 1991, O was struck in the hip by a stray bullet. Danny, Damien, and O palled around together and were always seen in the neighborhood flirting with girls. The 3 boys often hung out in an apartment which belonged to the older sister of one of their other friends who lived there with her daughter. She was like an older sister to many of the kids in the neighborhood, and she would allow them to hang out there as a way to keep them off the streets. On the evening of Monday, May 18, 1992, Damien, O, and Danny were all hanging out together in an apartment on the 4th floor, watching the film Scarface, while their host went downstairs to visit her mother. At around 10:45 p.m., a perpetrator or perpetrators entered the apartment, and when they exited, they left behind a slaughter. All 3 boys were shot dead. Otis O. Blair was shot 3 times in the head and once in the hand. Danny Santiago was shot once in the head. Damien Salgado was shot twice in the head and twice in the body. When the woman returned to her apartment shortly before 11 p.m., she entered to find the door was unlocked and noticed the 3 boys laying motionless around the apartment. She thought they were playing a joke on her, as the kids were known to do, but when she moved in closer, she noticed that they were covered in blood. She then ran to her mother's apartment and called the police. When police arrived to the scene to investigate, they collected evidence which included 2 crack vials on the floor and several 9mm casings. With some help from the community, police learned that 3 teenagers named Nicholas Taylor, Milton May Harris, and Cory Jackson were seen leaving the building soon after the murders. 3 days after the homicides, Taylor and Harris were located and brought in for questioning. Harris claimed to just be a bystander who witnessed some individuals but didn't see the actual murders, and he implicated Cory Jackson as the killer, and police were on the hunt for him. Taylor, who was a mentally delayed 13-year-old, said that he was standing in the stairwell when he witnessed Cory Jackson and 2 other men enter the apartment just before the shootings. However, both kids gave vastly different versions of events about what occurred that evening. The next day, police found Cory Jackson at Lincoln Hospital, suffering from numerous gunshot wounds and in critical condition. He never explained the reason behind his shooting and was booked for the triple homicide in his hospital bed. There was some talk on the streets that O's father, who was also named Otis and known as Big O, was the one who had shot Jackson as payback for killing his son. In the aftermath of the murders, allegations surfaced that the 3 kids worked for an 18-year-old local hustler named Pedro Rosario, who was known as Jungo or Pete Rock. Jungo ran a small drug gang which sold orange top crack vials, and the kids supposedly packaged vials for him. It was claimed that when he uncovered the 3 kids were skimming money from him, he ordered Jackson to kill them. Jungo and a 17-year-old named Gary Crespo were soon arrested and charged in connection with the triple homicide.
As it turns out, Milton Harris, the first person to name Jackson in the murders, is his cousin, and was more than just a bystander. One story alleges that he was Cory's lookout that evening, although he thought it was just going to be a robbery and didn't know he was going to kill anyone. But other allegations would later claim that he was much more involved in that and was a willing participant. After his arrest, Cory Jackson was charged with another murder from December 5th, 1991. It's alleged that a man named Charles Walker came to visit Jackson's sister when Jackson pulled a gun and attempted to rob him. Walker took off running and Jackson chased him into the Rosario grocery store on Cypress Avenue. Inside the store, Jackson demanded money from him, then shot Walker in the face, mortally wounding him.
The detective on that case was Mark Tebbens of the 40th Precinct in Mott Haven, and he produced a witness to this shooting, a crack addict who implicated Jackson in the murder. However, Tebbens would later be accused of extensive corruption and paying off false eyewitnesses in order to make cases against people.
After his arrest for the triple homicide, Pedro Rosario was also charged with an unrelated murder. Not long before the St. Anne's murders, Rosario had gotten into an argument with another teenager from the area named Jimmy Knott and shot him several times. Knott spent some time in the hospital before eventually passing away, and afterwards Rosario was charged with his killing. Jackson was first tried for the 1991 murder of Charles Walker, with the main prosecution witness against him being the crack addict who said that they saw him commit the homicide. In March of 1994, he was convicted and later sentenced to 25 to life. There were allegations that Mark Tebbens had paid off the eyewitness to implicate Jackson in the Walker murder, while others say that Jackson in fact killed him.
In April of 1994, Pedro Rosario stood trial for the murder of Jimmy Knott, and he was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 8.5 to 25 years in prison. But he still had to face trial for the 3 St. Anne's murders.
Shortly before Jackson, Crespo, and Rosario's trials were to begin, their defense teams filed a motion for dismissal, since the initial statements from Nicholas Taylor made in 1992 were not turned over to them until 3 years later. They argued that this constituted what's known as a Brady violation, and thus the charges should be dismissed. They learned that in one of Taylor's initial statements, he stated that he saw Cory Jackson exit the apartment before the gunshots rang out, and thus this exonerated Cory Jackson from being the killer. Taylor had also mentioned other possible perpetrators of the crime, including someone that he referred to as Flat Top. The prosecution claimed that they didn't turn over Taylor's statements because they believed them to be incredible and inconsistent, and also feared for Taylor's safety. In September of 1995, Taylor, who was now 16 years old, was summoned for an in-court examination and claimed to remember being at the scene and hearing gunshots, but couldn't recall anything else.
All 3 defendants' lawyers argued that Taylor's initial statements were exculpatory, and the fact that he no longer remembers the events greatly hindered their defense, and thus the charges should be dismissed. The judge agreed that the statements from Taylor should have been turned over sooner, but denied their request for dismissal, although he allowed them to use Taylor's statements at trial.
Taylor's notable mental disabilities and inability to recall events from that evening presented problems for the 3 defense teams, and they chose not to produce him at trial. Facing a possible life sentence if convicted at trial, Gary Crespo made the decision to cop out to a lesser charge of conspiracy in the 2nd degree. He was sentenced to 4.5 to 13 years in prison, while Rosario and Jackson chose to stand trial.
At Rosario's trial, the main prosecution witness against him was Milton May Harris, who said that he was a manager at one of his crack spots. He stated that it was just Otis Blair who worked for Rosario, and he was the only one accused of stealing from him.
Harris claimed that he was at a meeting with Crespo and Rosario shortly before the homicides, where they agreed to pay Jackson $2,500 to kill Blair and gave him the weapon used in the shootings. Although Blair was the only target, Jackson went ahead and killed all 3 kids in the apartment. The defense pointed the finger at Harris and claimed that he was the real killer and was only accusing the other men of the murders to take away blame from himself. But the prosecution's case convinced the jury, and on November 15, 1995, Pedro Jungo Rosario was convicted of 3 counts of second-degree murder and conspiracy, and 12 days later he was sentenced to 38.5 years to life.
During Jackson's trial, the main prosecution witness against him was also his cousin Milton Harris, who reiterated much of the same testimony he gave at Rosario's trial. Jackson too was convicted of the 3 St. Anne's murders, and in May of 1996, he was sentenced to 3 consecutive terms of 25 to life.
There are several theories about what actually occurred on the evening of May 18, 1992 at 350 St. Anne's Avenue. Many from the neighborhood have completely dismissed the idea that Crespo and Rosario were involved in the murders. They had both been good friends with Otis Blair since they were children, and not even Blair's family believed that they paid anyone to kill him. As it turns out, Otis Blair was running his own small-time hustle and never even worked for Rosario, and thus could never have stolen from his profits. Those who are certain that Harris's accusations were lies see his whole testimony as being bogus, and thus don't believe that Rosario was involved either.
One theory is that Cory Jackson planned this on his own and used Harris and Taylor as accomplices. Jackson was acquainted with the 3 kids from the neighborhood and knew about Blair's involvement in drug dealing. Jackson was described as an explosive and violent young man with a stone-cold disposition. Supposedly his motive was simply robbery, and he planned to enter the apartment, steal whatever drugs or money he found, then eliminate all the witnesses.
Another theory is that Harris and Jackson thought that the apartment was Jungo's stash spot and planned to rob then kill him so Harris could take over his business, but instead they entered to find Damien, Danny, and Otis there instead. Harris's testimony about Rosario and Crespo paying Jackson to carry out the murders is believed to be something that he either concocted on his own to take away blame from himself, or may have been coached by detectives on what to say. And since Harris blamed the others to save himself from a triple murder charge, he also had to make sure that they were off the streets to save himself from their retribution. Jackson was being held at the Brooklyn House of Detention and was involved in a slew of fights, and the jail marked him with a red tag indicating that he was a violent inmate. By chance, one of the jurors who convicted him at trial, Robert Manning, worked as a maintenance man in the jail, and Jackson had recognized him and made threatening remarks to him. A month after his sentencing, Jackson was being transferred through the jail to the maximum security wing when he noticed Robert Manning changing a light bulb. Jackson's handcuffs were removed to go through the metal detector, and that's when he sprinted towards Manning, pulled out a razor, and began slashing his face before being tackled by the guards. Jackson was allegedly trying to take his eyes out, but Manning happened to be wearing glasses, which protected them.
Manning required 60 stitches to close gashes over his face, scalp, and neck. Jackson was indicted for first-degree assault, but the case was never pursued since he was already serving 100 years. Gary Crespo served around 9 years in prison and was released. He has always vehemently denied any involvement in ordering the murders and still seeks to clear his name in the case. 2 defense investigators had interviewed Nicholas Taylor in 2004. In these interviews, he claimed that before his hearing in 1995, he was pressured by people close to the defendants to say that he couldn't remember anything.
In 2005, Taylor was interviewed again by defense investigators, and this time he told them a new story. He now said that he went with Harris and Jackson to an apartment building on Lexington Avenue as opposed to St. Anne's Avenue. He said that Harris and Jackson entered an apartment armed with guns, and he heard a dozen shots before they came running out. He also said that an authority told him to make sure that he said Cory Jackson was involved, otherwise there would be a $50,000 contract on his life in the streets. In April of 2006, Rosario's defense team filed a motion to vacate his guilty verdict and seek a new trial based on the statements that Taylor made, but his motion was denied. Rosario appealed the decision, again citing Taylor's statements, and also relying on a statement that Milton Harris's girlfriend made, where she said that Harris admitted to her that he committed the murders. But Nicholas Taylor's inconsistent, contradictory, and unreliable statements led to Rosario's conviction being upheld once again. All of Cory Jackson's appeals have been denied.
Mark Tebbens was also the lead detective in the criminal case against the Wild Cowboys gang and was accused of paying off numerous eyewitnesses to implicate them in crimes, which resulted in lengthy sentences for numerous members. Tebbens' involvement in many investigations which resulted in convictions led to those cases being reviewed by the Bronx DA, one of which is Cory Jackson's. The review of his cases are still ongoing, although not much new evidence in support of vacating either of his convictions has been uncovered. Cory Jackson is presently 51 years old and incarcerated at Sing Sing Prison. Pedro Rosario, now 52, is incarcerated at Greenhaven Prison. He was part of a program called Transforming Lives, where he writes about the racial injustices in the criminal legal system and speaks on the value of redemption and transformation. He also joined the RTA, Rehabilitation Through the Arts program, and has written and performed in plays. He has long claimed innocence in the St. Anne's murders, and after 31 years of incarceration, he continues seeking to have his convictions overturned. He is up for parole in 2034.
Because of inconsistent statements, a corrupt detective, and alleged false testimonies, questions still remain about exactly who participated in the murders of Damien Salgado, Danny Santiago, and Otis Blair, and what the true motives were.